The whispers cut through the cathedral like knives. Look at her dress, clearly homemade. I heard she works in a factory, in the slums. Poor Jonathan. What could he possibly see in her? Margaret's hands trembled as she held her simple bouquet of wildflowers. Every eye in that grand Boston cathedral was on her, judging her, dismissing her. She was the black seamstress who had somehow trapped one of the city's most eligible bachelors. That's all they saw. That's all they would ever see. Or so they thought. What none of them knew, not even Margaret herself, was that in exactly 3 weeks, a letter would arrive that would shatter every assumption they had ever made. A letter that would prove that sometimes the people society dismisses as nobodies are actually the ones holding all the power. But that revelation was still to come. For now, Margaret simply had to survive the longest walk of her life, down an aisle lined with contempt, toward a future no one believed she deserved. This is the story of how she proved them all wrong. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. The whispers started the moment Margaret stepped into the cathedral. She could feel dozens of eyes burning into her back, hear the rustle of expensive silk as women leaned toward each other, their lips moving behind gloved hands. The June sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows cast colorful shadows across the marble floor. But Margaret felt only darkness closing in around her. She walked alone down that endless aisle, her simple cream-colored dress a stark contrast to the elaborate gowns surrounding her. There was no father to give her away, no mother dabbing tears of joy with an embroidered handkerchief. Just Margaret, 28 years old, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself that morning from the garden behind the boarding house where she rented a room. At the altar, Jonathan waited. Tall, handsome Jonathan Mitchell, heir to the Mitchell textile fortune, son of one of Boston's most prominent families. When their eyes met, he smiled, and for a moment, Margaret forgot about everyone else in that massive church. But only for a moment. "Did you see her shoes?" A woman's voice carried from the third pew, deliberately loud enough to be heard. "Those are definitely not from Madame Laurent's boutique." "I heard she works as a seamstress," another voice added, "in the factory district. Can you imagine?" "Well, what did you expect? She's from, that part of town." Margaret's grip tightened on her bouquet. She had known this day would be difficult. She had prepared herself for the judgment, the sneers, the barely concealed disgust. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it in your bones are two very different things. The ceremony began. Reverend Thompson's voice echoed through the cathedral, speaking of love and commitment and the holy bond of matrimony. Margaret tried to focus on his words, on Jonathan's warm hand holding hers, on the gold band that would soon encircle her finger. But the whispers continued, a constant undercurrent beneath the Reverend's solemn pronouncements. Jonathan's mother, Catherine Mitchell, sat in the front pew wearing black, as if attending a funeral rather than her son's wedding. Her face was carved from stone, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Beside her, Jonathan's father, Charles Mitchell, stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly that Margaret could see the muscles working beneath his skin. They had tried everything to stop this wedding. Everything. 3 months earlier, when Jonathan first brought Margaret home to meet his parents, Catherine had actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle or an awkward giggle, but a full, harsh laugh that echoed through their mansion's drawing room. "You cannot be serious, Jonathan," Catherine had said, her eyes traveling up and down Margaret's form with unconcealed disdain. "This is some kind of joke, surely. Where did you actually meet this girl? At one of those charity events you insist on attending?" "Mother, please," Jonathan had said, his voice tight with anger. "Margaret is a nobody," Catherine interrupted. "A girl from the tenements with nothing to her name. Do you have any idea what people will say? What this will do to our family's reputation?" Charles had been more direct. He had offered Margaret money, $5,000 to walk away and never contact Jonathan again. When she refused, he increased it to $10,000, then $20,000. Each time, Margaret had looked him straight in the eye and declined. You don't understand, she had told him quietly. I love your son, and he loves me. No amount of money will change that. Love. Catherine had spat the word like poison. You know nothing about love, girl. You know only about survival, about grasping for a better life. My son is your meal ticket, your way out of poverty. Don't pretend it's anything more noble than that. The memory of those words burned in Margaret's mind even now, as she stood at the altar repeating her vows. She had wanted to scream at them, to tell them they knew nothing about her, about who she really was or where she had come from, but she had remained silent, swallowing her pride, because Jonathan had asked her to be patient. They'll come around, he had promised her, his arms wrapped around her in the tiny room she rented. Once they see how happy we are, once they get to know you, they'll understand. My parents aren't bad people, Margaret. They're just set in their ways. Give them time. But there had been no softening. If anything, Catherine and Charles had become more determined to end the relationship. They had hired private investigators to dig into Margaret's background, looking for scandals or secrets that might drive Jonathan away. They had cut off his allowance, hoping financial pressure would force him to reconsider. They had even threatened to disinherit him entirely. Jonathan had stood firm. I don't care about the money, he had told his parents. I don't care about any of it. I'm marrying Margaret with or without your blessing. And so here they were, standing before God and half of Boston society, exchanging vows while the Mitchell family's friends and associates looked on with expressions ranging from pity to disgust to barely concealed amusement. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Thompson declared. You may kiss the bride. Jonathan's lips were warm against hers, and for a few precious seconds, Margaret allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, everything would be all right. They were married now, legal, bound together. Surely that meant something. The reception was held at the Mitchell estate, a sprawling mansion overlooking the harbor. Catherine had insisted on hosting it, though not out of any warmth toward Margaret. No, she wanted to control the narrative, to show Boston society that while her son had made an unfortunate choice, the Mitchell family was still in command of the situation. Margaret stood in the corner of the ballroom watching couples glide across the polished floor. No one approached her. No one offered congratulations or well wishes. She was an island, alone in a sea of silk and diamonds and old money. Some champagne, ma'am? A waiter asked, appearing at her elbow with a silver tray. Thank you, Margaret said, taking a glass. The waiter, a young black man about her age, met her eyes for just a moment. In that brief glance, she saw recognition, sympathy, and something else. Respect, perhaps. He understood what it cost her to stand in this room, to hold her head high while everyone pretended she didn't exist. Margaret. Jonathan appeared, slightly breathless, his face flushed from dancing. There you are, come, I want you to meet some people. He led her across the ballroom to where a group of his college friends stood drinking and laughing. Their laughter died the moment Margaret approached. Everyone, this is my wife Margaret, Jonathan said proudly, his arm around her waist. Margaret, these are some of my oldest friends, Thomas, William, and Henry. We went to Harvard together. Congratulations, old man, Thomas said, but his eyes never left his champagne glass. Quite a surprise, your announcement. Yes, William added, his tone carefully neutral. We had no idea you were even seeing anyone seriously. The conversation was stilted, uncomfortable. Jonathan tried valiantly to include Margaret, to draw her into discussions about people and places she knew nothing about. But it was clear his friends wanted nothing to do with her. After a few excruciating minutes, they made polite excuses and drifted away. I'm sorry, Jonathan whispered, his forehead pressed against hers. I thought they would be different. I thought, it's all right, Margaret lied. Really, I understand. But she didn't understand. Not really. How could people be so cruel? How could they judge her so completely without knowing anything about her? She had worked hard her entire life. She had educated herself, reading every book she could get her hands on. She had saved every penny, dreaming of a better future. She was kind, honest, hard-working. But none of that mattered to these people. All they saw was her dark skin, her humble clothes, her lack of pedigree. As the evening wore on, Margaret's isolation became more pronounced. Women who would normally never dream of being so openly rude found ways to turn their backs when she approached. Men looked through her as if she were invisible. Even the servants, who surely knew what it was like to be dismissed and discarded, avoided her eyes. Catherine held court near the fireplace, surrounded by her closest friends. Margaret couldn't hear what they were saying, but she didn't need to. The frequent glances in her direction, the sympathetic pats on Catherine's arm, the slow shaking of heads said everything. "How are you holding up?" a voice asked. Margaret turned to find Jonathan's younger sister, Elizabeth, standing beside her. Unlike the rest of the family, Elizabeth had been kind from the start. She was only 19, still idealistic enough to believe that love could conquer all obstacles. "I've been better," Margaret admitted. "They're horrible," Elizabeth said fiercely. "All of them. I'm ashamed to be part of this family sometimes." "Don't say that. They're your family. They love you." "They love their idea of what I should be," Elizabeth corrected. "Just like they loved their idea of who Jonathan should marry, some pale, simpering debutante who would smile and nod and never have an original thought in her head." She squeezed Margaret's hand. "I'm glad Jonathan found you instead. You're real. You're brave. And despite what everyone in this room thinks, you're exactly what this family needs." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea how much that means to me." The evening finally ended. Guests departed, offering Catherine effusive thanks for a lovely party, while studiously ignoring the bride. Jonathan had arranged for them to spend their wedding night at a hotel downtown, before leaving on a brief honeymoon to Newport. As their carriage pulled away from the Mitchell estate, Margaret looked back at the mansion glowing in the darkness. She had survived. She had made it through this gauntlet of judgment and scorn. But she knew, deep in her bones, that this was only the beginning. The real battle for acceptance, for respect for her place in Jonathan's world was just starting. What neither Margaret nor any of the sneering guests at that wedding reception knew was that everything was about to change. In exactly 3 weeks, a letter would arrive that would shake the foundations of Boston society. A letter that would reveal secrets buried for 30 years. A letter that would prove, beyond any doubt, that sometimes the people we dismiss as nobodies are actually the ones holding all the power. But that letter hadn't arrived yet. For now, Margaret was simply a seamstress from the poor part of town who had somehow snared one of Boston's most eligible bachelors. For now, she was the target of gossip and derision. For now, she was nothing, or so they all believed. The honeymoon in Newport should have been magical. The seaside resort town was beautiful in early summer, with its grand hotels and ocean views, its promenades filled with wealthy vacationers. But even there, hundreds of miles from Boston, Margaret could not escape the weight of judgment. Other guests at their hotel whispered when she and Jonathan entered the dining room. The maitre d' had tried very politely to suggest they might be more comfortable taking their meals in their room. Jonathan had been furious, demanding to see the manager, insisting on their right to dine wherever they pleased. They had gotten their table, but the victory felt hollow. Every bite of food turned to ash in Margaret's mouth as she felt dozens of eyes watching her, judging her, finding her wanting. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said for the 100th time. "I didn't think it would be like this everywhere. I thought once we were away from Boston, from my family." "It's not your fault," Margaret replied, though part of her wondered if it was. Had he truly been so sheltered that he didn't understand what their marriage would mean, what she would face every single day for the rest of her life? They cut the honeymoon short, returning to Boston after only 5 days instead of the planned 2 weeks. Jonathan had found them a small townhouse in a respectable neighborhood, using money from his trust fund that his parents couldn't touch. It was modest by Mitchell standards, but to Margaret, who had spent her entire life in crowded boarding houses and tiny rented rooms, it seemed like a palace. She threw herself into making it a home. She sewed curtains for the windows, arranged flowers in vases, learned to cook the dishes Jonathan had grown up eating. She wanted to be the perfect wife, to prove to everyone, especially to herself, that she deserved this life, this love, this chance. But Boston society had other ideas. The calling cards that should have arrived, welcoming the new bride into the social circle, never materialized. The invitations to teas and luncheons and charity events that should have filled their mailbox remained conspicuously absent. Margaret Mitchell had become a ghost, invisible to everyone who mattered. Elizabeth visited often, bringing news from the Mitchell household. Catherine was telling everyone that Jonathan had been temporarily bewitched, that the marriage wouldn't last. Charles was still hoping to find some legal loophole that might invalidate the union. The rest of the family was simply pretending Jonathan no longer existed. "Mother removed all your photographs from the house," Elizabeth reported one afternoon, her voice tight with anger. "Every single one. It's as if you were never part of this family at all." Jonathan's face had gone pale. Margaret had reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. She knew how much his family meant to him, how deeply this rejection cut. He had given up everything for her. Everything. And what had she given him in return? A tiny townhouse, a wife no one would acknowledge, isolation from everyone he had ever known. The doubts crept in during the long afternoons when Jonathan was at the office, trying to build a career outside of his father's company. Margaret would sit in their parlor, sewing to earn extra money, and wonder if she had been selfish. If she had truly loved Jonathan, shouldn't she have walked away? Shouldn't she have spared him this pain? 2 months after the wedding, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The news brought her the first real joy she had felt since marrying Jonathan. A baby. Their baby. Surely this would soften Catherine's heart. Surely the prospect of a grandchild would bridge the chasm between them. She had been so naive. When Jonathan told his parents about the pregnancy, Catherine's response had been swift and brutal. She sent a letter, delivered by private messenger, typed on thick cream-colored stationery embossed with the Mitchell family crest. Margaret had been the one to open it. Jonathan was at work, and she had thought perhaps, just perhaps, it might be an olive branch, an invitation to tea, a tentative step toward reconciliation. Instead, she found 3 sentences that would haunt her for weeks. "Your child will never be acknowledged as a Mitchell. It will inherit nothing from this family. You have stolen my son's future, and I will never forgive you." Margaret had dropped the letter as if it burned her fingers. She had sat down heavily in the nearest chair, one hand pressed against her still flat stomach. Her child. Her innocent unborn child. Already rejected. Already deemed unworthy before it had even drawn breath. When Jonathan came home that evening, he found her exactly where she had been for hours, the letter lying on the floor at her feet. He read it, his face darkening with each word. "This is unconscionable," he said quietly. Too quietly. Margaret recognized that tone. It was the voice of a man pushed beyond his limits. "I'm going to see them. Right now. Tonight. This ends now." "Jonathan, no." "Yes," he interrupted, his voice rising. "Yes, Margaret. This has gone too far. Our child? They're threatening our child? No, absolutely not. I won't allow it." He had stormed out, leaving Margaret alone with her fears. She paced the townhouse for hours, waiting, worrying. What if this confrontation made things worse? What if Charles followed through on his threat to disinherit Jonathan completely? What would they do? How would they survive? It was past midnight when Jonathan finally returned. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes red. Margaret knew immediately that it had not gone well. "They won't budge," he said hoarsely. "I begged them. I actually got on my knees and begged my own mother to show some compassion, some humanity. She looked at me like I was a stranger." He collapsed onto the sofa, his head in his hands. "My father said I made my choice, and now I have to live with the consequences. He said I was dead to them." Margaret knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be all right. But the words stuck in her throat. How could she promise that? How could she be sure? The next few months passed in a strange, isolated bubble. Jonathan worked long hours at a small trading company, a position far beneath his abilities but the only one he could secure without his father's connections. Margaret sewed whenever she could, taking in piecework from a factory in the North End. The money was barely enough to keep them afloat, but they managed. Barely. Margaret's pregnancy progressed. She grew round and uncomfortable, her ankles swelling, her back aching. There was no money for a fancy doctor, so she made do with a midwife from the neighborhood, a kind Irish woman named Mrs. O'Brien who charged reasonable rates and didn't judge. "You're strong," Mrs. O'Brien told her during one visit. "You'll do just fine when your time comes. Don't you worry about what those fancy folks say. Baby don't care if its mama is rich or poor. Baby just needs love." But Margaret did worry. She worried constantly. About money. About Jonathan's growing unhappiness, about bringing a child into a world that had already decided it was unwanted. She lay awake at night, feeling the baby move inside her, and wondered what kind of life this child would have. Would it face the same prejudice she had? The same doors slammed in its face? The same whispered cruelties? It was during one of these sleepless nights, 6 months into her pregnancy, that Margaret made a decision. She couldn't change who she was or where she came from. She couldn't force Boston society to accept her. But she could control one thing. She could stop hiding. The next morning, she put on her best dress, fixed her hair carefully, and set out for the Mitchell estate. She had no illusions about what kind of reception she would receive, but she was tired of being a victim, tired of letting Catherine Mitchell control the narrative of her life. The butler, Henderson, answered the door. His eyes widened in shock when he saw her. "Mrs. Mitchell is not receiving visitors," he said quickly. "I'm not a visitor," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm family, and I need to speak with her." "I'm afraid that's quite impossible." "Tell her I'm here, Henderson. Tell her I'm pregnant with her grandchild. Tell her that if she doesn't speak to me now, she'll never have another chance." Something in Margaret's voice must have convinced him. He disappeared into the house, leaving her standing on the doorstep. She could hear voices inside, Catherine's sharp tone, the butler's apologetic murmur, then footsteps approaching. Catherine appeared in the doorway. She looked older than Margaret remembered, thinner with new lines around her mouth. For just a moment something flickered in her eyes. Curiosity, uncertainty. But then her expression hardened again. "You have 5 minutes," Catherine said coldly. "Say what you came to say." Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm not here to beg for your acceptance. I'm not here to ask for money or favors. I'm here to tell you that you're making a terrible mistake. The only mistake was my son marrying you." "No," Margaret said firmly. "The mistake is you throwing away your relationship with Jonathan. The mistake is you letting your pride and your prejudice cost you your son. Because that's what's happening, Mrs. Mitchell. Every day you refuse to acknowledge me, you lose a little more of him. And soon there will be nothing left to lose." Catherine's lips thinned. "Don't you dare lecture me about my son. You know nothing about what it means to be a mother, to want the best for your child." "I will soon," Margaret interrupted, placing a hand on her swollen belly. "And when I do, I will love my child unconditionally. I will support my child's choices, even if I don't understand them. Because that's what real love is. Not control. Not conditions, just love." For a long moment, Catherine said nothing. She stared at Margaret's stomach, at the visible proof of her grandchild's existence. Something passed across her face, too quick to identify. Longing, regret. But then the mask slammed back into place. "You should leave," Catherine said tightly, "before I have Henderson escort you from the property." Margaret nodded. She had known this was how it would end. But at least she had tried. At least she could tell herself and tell her child someday that she had made the effort. She turned to go, but Catherine's voice stopped her. "Margaret." It was the first time Catherine had ever used her first name. Margaret turned back, hope flaring briefly in her chest. "I won't change my mind," Catherine said, but her voice was different now, quieter, almost sad. "I can't. Do you understand? I can't." Can't or won't? Catherine didn't answer. She simply stepped back and closed the door, leaving Margaret standing alone on the steps. The walk home was long. Margaret's feet ached, and her back throbbed with each step. But she kept her head high, her shoulders back. She had done what she needed to do. The rest was up to Catherine. That evening, when Jonathan came home, she told him about the visit. He was furious at first, worried that his mother might have hurt her or the baby. But Margaret calmed him, explaining that she had needed to try, needed to at least make the attempt before their child was born. Nothing will change, Jonathan said bitterly. My mother is the most stubborn woman in Boston. Once she makes up her mind about something, that's it. There's no reasoning with her. Maybe, Margaret agreed. But at least now she knows I'm not going to disappear. I'm not going to make it easy for her to pretend I don't exist. 3 weeks later, on a crisp October morning, Margaret went into labor. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, wave after wave of it, threatening to split her in two. Mrs. O'Brien was there, and Elizabeth had defied her parents to come and hold Margaret's hand through the worst of it. Jonathan paced outside the bedroom door, his footsteps wearing a path in the carpet. Margaret could hear him murmuring prayers, bargaining with God, begging for everything to be all right. After 18 hours of labor, their daughter was born. She came into the world screaming, her tiny fists waving, her skin a beautiful shade that was neither Margaret's deep brown nor Jonathan's pale white, but something uniquely her own. She's perfect, Elizabeth whispered, tears streaming down her face. Absolutely perfect. They named her Grace. Grace Elizabeth Mitchell, a name full of hope and new beginnings. Jonathan held his daughter for the first time, his face transformed with wonder. Hello, little one, he murmured. Hello, Grace. Welcome to the world. Margaret watched them through exhausted, joy-filled eyes. This moment, right here, made everything worth it. Every snub, every whisper, every cruel word. All of it faded away in the face of this tiny miracle they had created. But even in her happiness, Margaret couldn't help wondering what would happen next. Would Catherine's heart soften when she learned she had a granddaughter? Or would Grace, like her mother, be deemed unworthy of the Mitchell name? The answer came 2 days later, delivered once again by messenger. But this time the letter was not from Catherine. It was from Charles Mitchell's lawyer, and it contained news that would change everything. Jonathan brought the letter upstairs to where Margaret was resting, little Grace sleeping peacefully in a cradle beside the bed. His face was ashen, his hands trembling slightly as he held out the envelope. It's from Whitmore and Associates, he said, my father's law firm. Margaret's stomach dropped. What do they want? I don't know. I wanted us to open it together. With shaking fingers, Jonathan broke the seal and unfolded the thick legal document inside. They read it together, Margaret's heart pounding harder with each line. But it wasn't what they expected. Not at all. The letter informed them that Charles Mitchell had established a trust fund for Grace. $50,000 to be held until she reached the age of 21. It was an enormous sum. More money than Margaret had ever dreamed of seeing in her lifetime. I don't understand, Margaret whispered. Why would he do this? Jonathan was staring at the letter as if it might bite him. It says here that the money is for Grace only, not for us. We can't touch it, can't use it for anything. It's solely for her education and future. But why? Your parents made it very clear they wanted nothing to do with our child. I don't know, Jonathan said slowly. Unless this is my father's way of providing for her without having to acknowledge her publicly. He can tell himself he's doing the right thing, being responsible, without actually having to change his position. It felt wrong somehow. Tainted. Blood money, Margaret thought. A payment to assuage a guilty conscience without requiring any real change or growth. But as she looked at Grace, sleeping peacefully, innocent and unaware of the complicated world she had been born into, Margaret couldn't bring herself to refuse it. This money could give her daughter opportunities Margaret had never had. Education, security, choices. We should accept it, she said finally. For Grace, not for us, but for her. Jonathan nodded slowly. You're right. Though it sticks in my throat to take anything from them after how they've treated you. Treated us. 2 weeks passed. Margaret was recovering from childbirth, learning the exhausting rhythms of new motherhood. Grace was a demanding baby, crying often, feeding constantly. Margaret was tired beyond measure, but also happier than she had ever been. When she held her daughter, felt that small, warm weight in her arms, nothing else mattered. Then, on a gray November morning, everything changed. Margaret was nursing Grace when she heard the knock at the door. Henderson, the Mitchell family butler, stood on the doorstep, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, and for a confused moment Margaret thought he was addressing her. But then she realized he was asking for her. "I have a message from Mrs. Catherine Mitchell. She requests your presence at the estate this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. After everything Catherine had done, everything she had said, why should Margaret go running just because the great Catherine Mitchell had deigned to summon her? But curiosity won out. What could Catherine possibly want? At 2:45, Margaret stood once again on the steps of the Mitchell estate. This time she held Grace in her arms, wrapped snugly in a blanket Elizabeth had knitted. If Catherine wanted to see her, she would see both of them. Margaret was done hiding, done apologizing for her existence. Henderson showed her to the drawing room, the same room where she had first met Catherine all those months ago. The older woman sat by the window, her back ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't turn when Margaret entered. "You brought the baby," Catherine said finally. "Her name is Grace. I know what you named her." Catherine's voice was tight, controlled. "You used my daughter's name. Elizabeth is my sister now. She's been kinder to me than anyone in this family. It seemed right to honor her." Silence fell. Margaret waited, refusing to be the first to speak. Let Catherine explain why she had summoned her here. Let her make the effort for once. Finally, Catherine turned. Her eyes went immediately to the bundle in Margaret's arms, and something flickered across her face. Hunger. Longing. The look of a woman who desperately wanted something she had convinced herself she couldn't have. "May I?" Catherine began, then stopped. Started again. "May I see her?" Margaret's arms tightened instinctively around Grace. Every protective instinct she had screamed at her to refuse, to shield her daughter from this woman who had caused them so much pain. But she thought of Jonathan's haunted eyes, of the photographs Catherine had removed, of the family torn apart by pride and prejudice. Slowly she crossed the room and carefully pulled back the blanket, revealing Grace's small, perfect face. Catherine gasped, actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her carefully powdered cheeks. "She looks like him," Catherine whispered. "Like Jonathan when he was a baby. The same nose, the same chin. She has his eyes too," Margaret said softly. "Blue, like the ocean. May I hold her?" Margaret hesitated. This woman had tried to destroy her marriage, had rejected her grandchild before she was even born, had caused Jonathan unspeakable pain. But she was also Grace's grandmother. And Margaret understood, perhaps better than Catherine knew, what it meant to be denied family, to be shut out from love. "Yes," Margaret said finally. "You may hold her." She placed Grace carefully in Catherine's arms, showing her how to support the baby's head. Catherine held her granddaughter as if she were made of spun glass, her entire body trembling. "Hello, little one," Catherine murmured. "Hello, Grace. I'm your grandmother." The words hung in the air between them. Your grandmother. An acknowledgement, a claim, a bridge across the chasm that had divided them. "I was wrong," Catherine said suddenly, her eyes still fixed on Grace's face. "About so many things. I told myself I was protecting Jonathan, protecting our family name. But really I was just afraid." "Afraid of what?" Margaret asked. "Of change, of losing control, of what people would say." Catherine laughed bitterly. Such foolish, small reasons to throw away my son's happiness, to miss the birth of my grandchild, to hurt someone who had never done anything except love my son. Margaret didn't know what to say. She had imagined this moment so many times, Catherine apologizing, admitting she was wrong. In her fantasies, it had always felt triumphant. But now, watching this proud woman cry over the grandchild she had almost lost, Margaret felt only sadness. "Charles doesn't know I invited you here," Catherine continued. "He's at his club, where he goes every Tuesday. He's even more stubborn than I am, and that's saying something. But I couldn't let another day pass without seeing her, without trying to make things right." "And how do you intend to do that?" Margaret asked quietly. "How do you make right months of cruelty and rejection?" "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "I don't know if I can, but I want to try. If you'll let me. If you can find it in your heart to forgive an old woman who let her pride nearly destroy everything that mattered." Grace chose that moment to wake up, her blue eyes opening wide, focusing on Catherine's face. She didn't cry. She simply stared, as if she were studying this stranger who held her with such gentle reverence. "She's beautiful," Catherine whispered. "Absolutely beautiful. And I almost missed knowing her. I almost let my prejudices rob me of this gift." She looked up at Margaret, tears still streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry for everything I said, everything I did. You deserved better. Jonathan deserved better. And this precious child deserved better." Margaret felt her own eyes filling with tears. Part of her wanted to hold on to her anger, to make Catherine suffer as she had suffered. But what good would that do? Wouldn't it just perpetuate the cycle of hurt and resentment? And more importantly, wouldn't it deny Grace the chance to know her grandmother? "I accept your apology," Margaret said carefully. "But Catherine, you need to understand something. I can forgive you for what you did to me. But Jonathan, he's the one you really hurt. He gave up everything for us, his family, his inheritance, his entire world, and you rejected him for it. That's going to take more than an apology to heal." "I know," Catherine said. "I know. And I don't expect him to forgive me easily. But I have to try. I have to make him understand that I was wrong, that I want him back in my life. All of you." They talked for over an hour, Catherine holding Grace the entire time. Margaret learned things she had never known about Jonathan's childhood, about the kind of boy he had been. Catherine shared stories about her own mother, about the rigid rules she had been raised with, about how fear and tradition had shaped her into someone she no longer recognized. "I convinced myself that accepting you would mean betraying everything I believed in," Catherine said. "But the truth is, everything I believed in was wrong. Family isn't about blood purity or social status. It's about love. And I was so busy protecting an idea of family that I destroyed the real thing." When it was time to leave, Catherine walked Margaret to the door herself, something she had never done before. She touched Grace's cheek one last time, her expression full of wonder. "Will you come back?" Catherine asked. "Please? Bring Jonathan next time if he'll come. I need to talk to him. I need to tell him." "I'll try," Margaret promised, "but I can't speak for him. He's hurt very deeply. I know. I have a lot to make up for. But I want to try. If it takes the rest of my life, I want to try." That evening, when Jonathan came home, Margaret told him everything. He listened in silence, his face unreadable. "She held Grace?" he asked finally. "Yes. And Jonathan..." She cried. Real tears. She was genuinely remorseful. One apology doesn't undo months of cruelty. "I know. I told her that. But it's a start, isn't it? If she's really willing to change, to accept us, shouldn't we give her the chance?" Jonathan was quiet for a long time, staring into the fireplace. "I don't know if I can," he said finally. "Every time I think about what she said to you, how she made you feel, I get so angry I can barely see straight. I understand, and I'm not asking you to forgive her right away. I'm just asking you to think about it. For Grace's sake. She deserves to know her grandparents." Over the next few weeks, Catherine sent letters, Not to Jonathan directly, but to Elizabeth, asking her to pass them along. In them, she apologized, explained, begged for a chance to make things right. She sent gifts for Grace, beautiful handmade blankets and silver spoons with the Mitchell crest. She asked repeatedly for permission to visit. Jonathan read each letter, his expression growing more conflicted with each one. Margaret watched him struggle, understanding that this decision had to be his own. She couldn't force him to forgive his mother, any more than Catherine could demand forgiveness. Finally, in early December, Jonathan made his decision. They would visit the Mitchell estate for Christmas dinner, just that once. A trial to see if Catherine's change of heart was genuine or simply another manipulation. The week before Christmas, another letter arrived. But this one wasn't from Catherine or the family lawyer. It was addressed to Margaret personally, in handwriting she didn't recognize. The return address was from a law firm in New York City. Margaret opened it with trembling hands, wondering what new complication had entered their already complicated lives. She read the first paragraph once, then again, certain she must have misunderstood. "Jonathan," she called out, her voice strange and distant to her own ears. "Jonathan, you need to see this." He came running, alarmed by her tone. "What is it? What's wrong?" Margaret handed him the letter, unable to speak. She watched as he read it, saw his eyes widen, saw the color drain from his face. "This can't be right," he whispered. "This has to be some kind of mistake." But it wasn't a mistake. The letter was very clear. Margaret's grandmother, a woman named Adelaide Morrison, had died 3 months earlier, and she had left Margaret everything. Her entire estate, including a massive textile company, real estate holdings in 3 states, and a personal fortune that dwarfed even the Mitchell family's wealth. The grandmother Margaret had never known existed, had made her one of the richest women in America, and suddenly everything changed. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the letter from New York spread before her, and tried to make sense of words that seemed impossible. Adelaide Morrison, her grandmother, a woman she had never met, never even heard of, had left her an empire. "I don't understand," she said for the 10th time. "My mother never mentioned any family. She always said we were alone in the world." Jonathan was reading through the additional documents that had arrived with the letter. Legal papers, property deeds, bank statements. His hands shook slightly as he turned each page. "According to this," he said slowly, "your grandmother was Adelaide Morrison, formerly Adelaide Winters. She married Henry Morrison in 1868 and built Morrison Textiles into one of the largest manufacturing operations in the country. She was widowed in 1895 and ran the company herself for the past 30 years. He looked up at Margaret, his eyes wide. "Your grandmother was one of the most powerful businesswomen in America, and none of us knew." "But why?" Margaret asked. "Why didn't I know about her? Why did my mother never tell me?" The lawyer's letter provided some answers, though they raised even more questions. Adelaide Morrison had a daughter named Rose, born in 1870. Rose had fallen in love with a man Adelaide disapproved of, a man of a different race. And when Rose refused to give him up, Adelaide had made a terrible choice. She had disowned her daughter completely, cutting her off without a penny, forbidding her from ever using the Morrison name again. Rose had married the man anyway, taking his name, Washington. She had a daughter, Margaret, born in 1897. But Rose's husband had died when Margaret was only 3 years old, and Rose herself had passed away 5 years later from pneumonia, leaving 8-year-old Margaret alone in the world. Margaret's hands trembled as she absorbed this information. Her mother had been cast out by her own family, rejected for marrying for love. It was eerily similar to what had happened with Jonathan's family, except Adelaide had never relented, never softened. Rose had died in poverty, and Adelaide had let it happen. "There's more," Jonathan said quietly. He handed Margaret another document. "Your grandmother spent the last 20 years trying to find you. She hired investigators, searched records, contacted orphanages and boarding houses across the country. But you had moved so many times, used different names in different places. By the time she finally located you, she was already ill. Terminal cancer, according to her doctor's report. The document included a personal letter from Adelaide, written in a shaky hand, dated just 3 weeks before her death. My dearest Margaret, it began. Though we have never met, you are my only living family, my precious granddaughter, and I have loved you from afar for many years. I write this knowing I have little time left, and knowing that I have committed the greatest sin of my life. I let pride and prejudice separate me from my daughter, and in doing so, I lost you both. I cannot undo what I have done. I cannot bring back the years I wasted or make up for the suffering my daughter endured because of my cruelty. But I can ensure that you never suffer as she did. Everything I built, everything I worked for, is yours now. Use it wisely. Use it to build a life your mother would have been proud of. And please, if you can find it in your heart, forgive a foolish old woman who learned too late what truly matters in this world. Margaret's tears fell onto the paper, blurring the carefully written words. Her grandmother, her mother, a whole history she had never known existed. She thought of Rose, her mother, dying young and poor, rejected by her own family. She thought of herself, alone in the world at 8 years old, believing she had no one. And all the while Adelaide Morrison had been searching, trying to find the granddaughter she had thrown away along with her daughter. It's like looking in a mirror, Margaret whispered. Catherine and Adelaide, both of them rejecting their children for marrying the wrong person. Both of them losing everything because of their pride. But there's a difference, Jonathan said gently. Catherine is trying to make amends while she still can. Your grandmother ran out of time. The next few days were a whirlwind. The lawyers from New York arrived to help Margaret navigate the complex inheritance. The Morrison Textile Company alone was worth over $3 million. There were properties in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, investment portfolios, jewelry, art collections. The sheer scope of it was overwhelming. You're one of the wealthiest women in America, one of the lawyers, Mr. Hastings, explained. The board of directors has been managing the company since your grandmother's death, but ultimate control rests with you now. You'll need to appoint someone to represent your interests, make decisions about the company's future. Margaret looked at Jonathan, then back at Mr. Hastings. I want to understand the business first before I make any major decisions. Can you arrange for me to visit the factory, meet with the board, review the accounts? Mr. Hastings looked surprised. Most heiresses would simply appoint a manager and collect the profits, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm not most heiresses, Margaret said firmly. This company was built by my grandmother. My mother died poor because of decisions made about this business. I need to understand it, all of it, before I decide what to do next. Word of Margaret's inheritance spread through Boston like wildfire. The same society matrons who had snubbed her at her wedding suddenly discovered they had time for tea. The same men who had looked through her as if she were invisible now tipped their hats when they passed her on the street. Invitations poured in, everyone suddenly eager to welcome Mrs. Jonathan Mitchell into their social circle. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so pathetic. Elizabeth visited, laughing despite herself. You should see Mother's face, she said. She's been telling everyone for months that you trapped Jonathan, that you were a gold digger who wanted his money, and now it turns out you have more money than our entire family combined. She doesn't know whether to be relieved or horrified. But Catherine herself said nothing. The Christmas dinner invitation still stood, but there had been no mention of Margaret's changed circumstances. Either Catherine hadn't heard the news, which seemed impossible given how fast gossip traveled in Boston, or she had chosen not to acknowledge it. Margaret spent her days learning about Morrison Textiles. She visited the factories, shocking the managers by actually walking the floor, talking to the workers, asking questions about wages and working conditions. What she found disturbed her deeply. The workers, mostly immigrant women and children, labored 12 hours a day in dangerous conditions for wages that barely kept them alive. The factories were cramped and poorly ventilated. There were no safety regulations, no protections for workers who were injured on the job. This is standard for the industry, the factory manager, Mr. Hutchins, explained when Margaret questioned him. If we improve conditions or raise wages, our costs will go up. We'll lose our competitive advantage. These women work for my company, Margaret said coldly. They make the products that generate my profits. And you're telling me we can't afford to ensure they have safe working conditions and fair wages? Mrs. Mitchell, with all due respect, you don't understand the business. Then explain it to me, Margaret interrupted. Show me the numbers. Show me exactly how much it would cost to improve conditions and raise wages. I want a full report on my desk by Monday. She left the factory with her heart heavy. This was her grandmother's legacy. This was what Adelaide Morrison had built. Profit squeezed from the labor of desperate women who had no choice but to accept whatever pittance they were offered. But it was also her legacy now, and she could change it. That evening, she discussed everything with Jonathan. He had been quiet since the inheritance news, and Margaret worried that it bothered him, that his pride was hurt by his wife suddenly having more money than his entire family. Are you all right? She asked him. With all of this? Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Do you want the truth? Always. Part of me feels relieved, he admitted. We struggled so hard these past months. I hated not being able to provide for you properly, give you the life you deserved. And now that pressure is gone, but another part of me feels like a failure. I'm supposed to take care of you, and instead you're the one with all the money and power. Jonathan Mitchell, Margaret said firmly, taking his hands in hers. You gave up everything for me. Everything. When your parents told you to choose, you chose me. When society turned its back on us, you stood by me. You are not a failure. You're the bravest man I've ever known. I just worry, he said softly. I worry that you'll realize you don't need me anymore, that you could have any life you want, and being married to a failed businessman wasn't part of that plan. Margaret pulled him close, resting her forehead against his. I didn't marry you for money or status or anything else. I married you because I love you, because you're kind and good and you see me, really see me as a person. That hasn't changed. Money doesn't change that. I love you, Jonathan whispered. So much. I love you too, and we're going to figure this out together, all of it. The next day, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Charles Mitchell appeared at their door without Henderson, without his usual entourage of lawyers and assistants. Just Charles, looking older and more uncertain than Margaret had ever seen him. May I come in? He asked. Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside. Jonathan is at work. I know. I came to see you. They sat in the parlor, an awkward silence stretching between them. Finally, Charles spoke. I owe you an apology, he said stiffly. I judged you unfairly. I assumed you were after Jonathan's money, that you had trapped him somehow. I was wrong. Yes, you were. Charles flinched at her blunt response, but continued. Catherine told me about your visit, about Grace. She said you were gracious and forgiving, even after everything we put you through. He paused. I don't expect you to forgive me as easily. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry. Why now? Margaret asked. Is it because you found out about my inheritance? Because suddenly I'm respectable? No, Charles said, and to Margaret's surprise he looked genuinely offended. Though I won't lie and say the news didn't shock me. But Catherine's been talking about Grace nonstop since she met her, about her eyes, her smile, the way she grabs onto your finger. And I realized I've missed 3 months of my granddaughter's life because of my own stubborn pride. Just like your grandmother missed your entire life. He pulled out a photograph, handled so often it was worn around the edges. A young woman laughing, her arms around a man who gazed at her with obvious adoration. This is my sister, Rebecca, Charles said quietly. She died when I was 16. Pneumonia, same as your mother. She was engaged to a man my parents disapproved of. They forbade the marriage, threatened to disown her if she went through with it. She was preparing to marry him anyway when she got sick. She died before the wedding could take place. He stared at the photograph, his eyes distant. I've spent my entire life telling myself that my parents were right to oppose the match, that they were protecting Rebecca. But the truth is, they weren't protecting her from anything. They were just protecting their own pride, their idea of what our family should be. And she died miserable, torn between love and duty. He looked up at Margaret. When Jonathan told us he wanted to marry you, I saw Rebecca all over again. I thought I was protecting him from making a mistake, but I was really just repeating my parents' mistake, and I nearly lost my son because of it. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Why didn't you tell Jonathan this about Rebecca? Because I'm a foolish old man who's better at building empires than building relationships. Charles smiled sadly. But Catherine's given me a second chance, and I don't intend to waste it. Will you and Jonathan come to Christmas dinner, please? It won't be easy, and I know we have a lot to work through. But I want to try. We want to try. Margaret thought about Adelaide Morrison, dying alone, her last letter filled with regret. She thought about Rose, her mother, dying young and poor, separated from the family that should have loved her. She thought about all the ways pride and prejudice destroyed families, created wounds that never healed. We'll come, she said finally. But Charles, you need to understand something. I'm not coming because of my money or my inheritance. I'm coming because family matters, and because Grace deserves to know her grandparents. But if there's any hint that you or Catherine are only accepting me now because I'm wealthy, there won't be, Charles promised. I swear it. We want to know you, the real you, and we want to be part of Grace's life if you'll let us. When Jonathan came home that evening, Margaret told him about Charles's visit. They talked long into the night about forgiveness, about second chances, about whether people could really change. I think we should go, Jonathan said finally. Not because they deserve it, but because we deserve to find out if things can be different, and because Grace deserves a family. Christmas Day arrived cold and clear. Margaret dressed carefully, putting on one of her old dresses rather than any of the expensive new ones she could now afford. She wanted the Mitchells to see her as she was, not as her money made her appear. The dinner was awkward at first, everyone stepping carefully around old wounds. But then Grace, who had been sleeping in Elizabeth's arms, woke up and started to fuss. Catherine immediately reached for her, cooing softly, and just like that, the ice began to thaw. They talked about ordinary things, the weather, Elizabeth's studies, Grace's sleeping habits. Nothing deep or profound, but it was a start, a tentative bridge across the chasm that had divided them. As the evening wound down, Catherine pulled Margaret aside. I heard about the factories, she said quietly. About the changes you're planning to make. Better wages, safety improvements, shorter hours. Is there a problem? Margaret asked, her voice cool. No, Catherine said quickly. No problem. I just wanted to say, I admire what you're doing, using your power to help people who have no power of their own. It's brave. It's right. And I'm proud to have you as a daughter-in-law. Margaret felt something inside her chest loosen, a tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Thank you, she whispered. That means more than you know. But even as Margaret began to find peace with Jonathan's family, a storm was brewing. The news of her planned reforms at Morrison Textiles had reached the other factory owners in Boston, and they were not pleased. If Margaret succeeded in improving conditions and raising wages, their workers would demand the same. It would cut into profits, upset the established order. They began to organize against her, plotting ways to undermine her authority, questioning whether a woman, especially a black woman, had any business running a major manufacturing company. Letters appeared in newspapers, signed by concerned citizens, suggesting that Margaret was naive and inexperienced, that she would drive Morrison Textiles into bankruptcy with her radical ideas. The real battle, Margaret realized, was just beginning. She had the money and the legal ownership, but she didn't have the respect or acceptance of Boston's business community. They would fight her every step of the way. But Margaret had learned something important over these past difficult months. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. She had survived rejection, scorn, isolation, and come out the other side. She had won over Catherine Mitchell, one of the most stubborn women in Boston. She had built a family from nothing, If she could do all that, she could certainly handle a few threatened businessmen. The war for Morrison Textiles, and for everything it represented, was about to begin. The first direct attack came in January, during Margaret's first official board meeting as owner of Morrison Textiles. She walked into the conference room carrying Grace in her arms, Elizabeth by her side to help with the baby. The 12 men seated around the long mahogany table looked at her with expressions ranging from condescension to outright hostility. "Gentlemen," Margaret said calmly, settling into the chair at the head of the table, "thank you for coming. I know you've been managing operations during my grandmother's illness, and I appreciate your service. But now it's time we discuss the future direction of this company." Richard Blackwell, the senior board member and largest shareholder after Margaret herself, cleared his throat importantly. "Mrs. Mitchell, perhaps it would be better if you appointed a qualified manager to handle day-to-day operations. A woman in your condition with a young child surely has enough to occupy her time without worrying about business matters." "My condition?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I recently gave birth, Mr. Blackwell, not contracted a terminal illness. And as for being occupied, I find I have plenty of time and energy to manage both my daughter and my company." "That's not what I meant," Blackwell said, his face reddening. "What I meant is that running a textile empire requires experience, knowledge, connections. Things that, through no fault of your own, you simply don't possess." "You're right," Margaret said, and watched surprise flicker across the men's faces. "I don't have experience running a textile company. But I do have experience working in one. I spent 5 years as a seamstress, working 12-hour days for wages that barely kept me alive. I know what it's like to breathe in fabric dust until your lungs ache. I know what it's like to have your fingers bleed from working the machines too fast. So while I may not have your business experience, gentlemen, I have something you don't. I understand the human cost of our profits." She pulled out Mr. Hutchins's report, which she had reviewed extensively over the past weeks. According to this analysis, improving safety conditions, reducing work hours to 10 per day, and raising wages by 20% would increase our costs by approximately 15%. Our profit margins would drop from 42% to 36%. We would still be highly profitable, just not quite as obscenely so. 36% isn't competitive, another board member, James Crawford, argued. "Other factories are running at 40 to 45%. We'll lose market share." "To whom?" Margaret asked. "Who are our primary customers, Mr. Crawford?" Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "Department stores mostly. Filene's, Jordan Marsh, R.H. Stearns." "And what do those stores care about? The price we charge them, or the conditions under which our products are made?" "The price, obviously." "Not anymore," Margaret said firmly. "I've already spoken with the buyers at each of those stores. I've explained our new policies and our commitment to ethical manufacturing. And do you know what they told me? They told me that more and more customers, particularly women, are asking questions about where their clothes come from. They want to know that the people making their dresses and shirts are treated fairly. Several stores are already planning to advertise that they carry Morrison Textiles specifically because of our improved labor practices." She could see she had their attention now. These were businessmen, after all. They might not care about workers suffering, but they cared very much about market advantage. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, "I've drafted a proposal to open a worker training program. We'll teach advanced skills to our most promising employees, giving them paths to higher-paying positions. This will reduce turnover, improve quality, and create loyalty. Workers who feel valued don't go on strike or sabotage production." Blackwell was shaking his head. "This is madness. You'll bankrupt us." "No, Mr. Blackwell. I'll transform us. Morrison Textiles will become the model that other companies have to follow or risk losing their best workers. We'll set the standard, and everyone else will have to meet it." The meeting lasted 3 more hours. Every proposal Margaret made was challenged, argued over, dissected, but she held firm, armed with facts and figures, and a determination that came from having lived the life her workers now lived. Finally, Blackwell played what he clearly thought was his trump card. You may be the majority shareholder, Mrs. Mitchell, but you're not the only shareholder. We have rights too. And if we believe your policies will damage the company, we can sue to prevent you from implementing them. You could, Margaret agreed. And you'd lose, because I've already had my lawyers review every aspect of my authority as owner. I have the legal right to make these changes. But more importantly, Mr. Blackwell, if you fight me on this, I will use my majority position to vote you off this board entirely. Every single one of you. And I'll replace you with people who share my vision. The room went silent. She could see them calculating, weighing their options. Finally, Blackwell nodded slowly. It seems we have no choice but to accept your proposals, he said coldly. No, Margaret corrected him gently. You have a choice. You can accept them willingly and help me build something better, or you can accept them resentfully and make everyone miserable in the process. I'd prefer the former, but I'll settle for the latter if I must. Over the next 3 months, Margaret's reforms began to take effect. Work hours were reduced, wages were raised, safety equipment was installed. A factory nurse was hired to treat minor injuries and illnesses. Child workers under 14 were sent home with severance pay and vouchers for school. The changes caused exactly the reaction Margaret had predicted. Workers at other factories began demanding the same improvements. Other factory owners found themselves facing strikes and work stoppages. Newspapers ran stories about the dramatic transformation at Morrison Textiles, with Margaret featured prominently. The society matrons who had mocked her at her wedding now invited her to speak at their charity events. Business leaders who had dismissed her as naive suddenly wanted her advice. She was profiled in newspapers and magazines, held up as an example of the new generation of enlightened industrialists. But Margaret didn't let the attention go to her head. She remembered too clearly what it felt like to be on the other side, to be dismissed and discarded. She continued to visit the factories regularly, talking to workers, listening to their concerns. She learned their names, asked about their families, made sure they knew they were valued. One afternoon in April, she was walking through the main factory floor when an older woman approached her hesitantly. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Anna Kowalski. I've worked here for 15 years. Hello, Anna. Is everything all right? More than all right, ma'am. Anna's eyes were wet with tears. I just wanted to thank you for the changes you've made. My daughter, she's 12. She was working here too, but now she's in school instead, learning to read and write. Because of you. Because you sent her home and paid for her education. Margaret felt her own throat tighten. Every child deserves an education, Anna. Every child deserves a chance. I know you understand, Anna said softly. Because you were one of us once. You remember what it's like. That's why you're different from the others. That's why we trust you. After Anna walked away, Margaret stood for a long moment on the factory floor, watching the workers at their machines. They were still working hard, still producing the textiles that generated Morrison's profits. But they looked different now. Their faces were less drawn, less exhausted. Some of them were actually smiling as they worked, chatting with their neighbors. This was what her grandmother had never understood. That treating people with dignity and respect didn't just benefit the workers, it benefited everyone. That evening, the Mitchell family gathered at the estate for dinner, something that had become a weekly tradition. Catherine had insisted on it, wanting to make up for lost time. Charles had even started playing with Grace, getting down on the floor with his granddaughter, making silly faces that sent her into peals of laughter. I have some news, Elizabeth announced during dessert. I've been accepted to the Women's College in Connecticut. I'll be starting in the fall. Catherine's face fell. But Elizabeth, that's so far away. And is college really necessary? You could stay here, make your debut next season. Mother, Elizabeth interrupted gently. I don't want to make my debut. I want an education. I want to do something meaningful with my life like Margaret is doing. Margaret felt Catherine's eyes on her. For a moment she worried that Catherine would blame her for Elizabeth's decision. But then Catherine smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. You're right, Catherine said quietly. You should go to college. You should have every opportunity to become the woman you want to be. I'm proud of you, darling." It was a small moment, but significant. Catherine was learning slowly but surely to let go of her rigid expectations and accept her children as they were. Later that night, as Margaret and Jonathan prepared for bed, he pulled her close. "You know what today is?" he asked. Margaret thought for a moment, then smiled. "1 year since we married." "1 year since I made the best decision of my life," Jonathan corrected, even though at the time I had no idea what I was getting into. "Having regrets?" Margaret teased. "Not a single one, though I will admit I didn't expect my wife to become more famous than my entire family combined." Margaret laughed. "I didn't expect it either. Sometimes I still can't believe any of this is real, that I went from a seamstress in a boarding house to this. You didn't just become wealthy, Margaret. You became powerful, and you're using that power to change things, to make them better. That's what I admire most about you." "I couldn't have done any of it without you," Margaret said seriously. "When everyone else was telling me I didn't belong, that I wasn't good enough, you believed in me. You saw me, the real me. And I loved what I saw," Jonathan whispered, kissing her forehead. "I still do." In June, Margaret received another letter, this one from the Women's Trade Union League in New York. They wanted her to speak at their national convention, to share her experience reforming Morrison Textiles. Margaret accepted, though she was nervous about public speaking. The convention was held in a grand hotel ballroom, filled with hundreds of women who had fought for workers' rights, often at great personal cost. Margaret stood at the podium, looking out at all those faces, and suddenly felt the weight of responsibility. "I'm not here to lecture anyone," she began. "You've all been fighting this fight far longer than I have. But I wanted to share what I've learned over the past year. I learned that change is possible, even when everyone tells you it isn't. I learned that standing up for what's right is worth the cost, no matter how high. And I learned that the greatest power we have is the power to see each other's humanity, even when society tells us not to." She talked about the factories, about the women and children who had worked there. She talked about Anna Kowalski and her daughter, now in school. She talked about the resistance she had faced and how she had overcome it. But most importantly, she concluded, "I learned that progress isn't something that happens to us. It's something we make happen. Every time we refuse to accept injustice. Every time we stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves. Every time we choose compassion over cruelty. Every time we choose inclusion over exclusion. That's how we change the world. Not all at once, but one person, one decision, one act of courage at a time." The applause was thunderous. Women stood cheering, some openly weeping. Margaret felt tears running down her own cheeks. A year ago, she had stood in a cathedral, listening to people mock her, question her worth, predict her failure. Now she stood here, using her voice to speak for thousands who had no voice. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been pain and rejection and moments when she had wanted to give up. But she had persevered. She had taken every insult, every setback, every moment of doubt and transformed them into determination. As Margaret traveled back to Boston, she thought about her grandmother Adelaide, alone at the end, full of regrets. She thought about her mother Rose, dying young and poor, separated from her family. She thought about all the might-have-beens and never-weres. But she also thought about the future, about Grace, growing up in a world that was slowly changing, about the workers at Morrison Textiles going home to families with full bellies and hope for tomorrow, about Jonathan, who had given up everything for love and found something even better, about Catherine and Charles, learning to let go of old prejudices and embrace new possibilities. The story could have ended so differently. If Jonathan had listened to his parents, if Margaret had accepted Charles's money and walked away, if Catherine had never softened her heart, if Adelaide had found Margaret sooner, or Rose had lived longer, or any of 100 other might-have-beens. But this was the story they had written together. Not a perfect story, not an easy one, but theirs. And it was still being written, one day at a time. 3 years later, Margaret stood once again in a cathedral, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The pews were filled with workers from Morrison Textiles, sitting alongside Boston Society matrons. Union organizers chatted amiably with wealthy businessmen who had adopted Margaret's labor practices. The cathedral was packed, people standing along the walls craning to see. They had come to celebrate the dedication of the Rose Washington Memorial School for Girls, a free school for the daughters of working families funded entirely by Margaret. Above the entrance was a bronze plaque with Rose's image, and a quote Margaret had chosen carefully. "Love is stronger than pride." Catherine stood beside Margaret holding 4-year-old Grace's hand. Elizabeth was there, home from college for the summer. Jonathan was on Margaret's other side, and in her arms was their second daughter, Adelaide Rose, named for both grandmothers, born just 2 months earlier. Charles gave a speech about the importance of education and opportunity. Several factory workers spoke about what the school meant to their families. And finally, Margaret stepped forward to cut the ribbon. "My mother never got the chance to finish her education," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "She was cut off from her family, from her opportunities, because she chose love over approval. This school is her legacy, a place where girls can learn, can grow, can become whatever they dream of being, where they'll be judged not by their families or their circumstances, but by their character and their potential." She cut the ribbon, and the doors opened. Inside, classrooms waited, filled with books and supplies. Teachers, carefully chosen for their compassion and skill, stood ready to welcome their students. This was just the beginning. Margaret had plans for more schools, in Boston and beyond. Plans for worker housing, for healthcare clinics, for programs to help immigrants learn English and find jobs. She had the money and the power to make it all happen. But more importantly, she had the will and the vision. That evening, back at the Mitchell estate, the extended family gathered for dinner. Catherine had insisted on hosting, wanting to celebrate Margaret's achievement. The dining room that had once felt so cold and hostile now rang with laughter and conversation. "To Margaret," Charles said, raising his glass, "who taught this old man that it's never too late to change? That forgiveness is possible. That family isn't about maintaining appearances or protecting traditions. It's about love." "To Margaret," everyone echoed. Margaret looked around the table at these people who had become her family. Jonathan, her partner in everything, Grace and baby Adelaide, her precious daughters, Elizabeth, her sister and friend, Catherine and Charles, who had learned to see past their prejudices, even some of the factory workers she had invited, sitting comfortably among Boston's elite. This was the life she had built. Not the one she had been born into, not the one society had told her she deserved, but the one she had fought for, brick by brick, decision by decision. "I have something to say, too," Margaret said, standing. "A year ago, I stood at my wedding, listening to people mock me, judge me, predict my failure. And I'll be honest, there were times when I thought they might be right. Times when I wondered if I really belonged in Jonathan's world, if I was strong enough to handle everything that came with loving him." She paused, looking at each person in turn. "But I learned something important. I learned that belonging isn't something that's given to you. It's something you claim for yourself. I learned that strength isn't about never being hurt or afraid. It's about getting up every time you're knocked down. And I learned that the most radical thing you can do in a world that tells you to know your place is to refuse to accept any limits at all." She raised her glass. "So here's to all of us, to second chances and new beginnings, to families built on love instead of obligation, to change, no matter how difficult or slow, and to the future, which is ours to shape however we choose." "Hear, hear!" Voices rang out around the table. As Margaret sat back down, Jonathan squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. "So incredibly proud. We did this together," Margaret reminded him. "All of it." Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the children were asleep, Margaret stood at the window of their bedroom, looking out at the city lights. She thought about the seamstress she had been, alone and struggling. She thought about the bride who had walked down an aisle full of hostile eyes. She thought about all the versions of herself she had been and all the versions she might still become. The journey wasn't over. There would be more battles to fight, more changes to make, more people to convince. But Margaret was ready. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, that love could conquer even the deepest prejudices, that one person, with courage and determination, really could change the world. She turned away from the window to find Jonathan watching her, a soft smile on his face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Margaret said. "And nothing. Just how far we've come. How different everything is from what I expected. Better or worse?" Margaret thought about it, really thought about it. About the pain and the struggle, but also about the victories and the joy. About losing things she never knew she had and finding things she hadn't known she needed. "Different," she said finally. "Not better or worse. Just ours." And that, she realized, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The girl who had once been mocked for her origins, dismissed as a nobody, written off as unworthy, had proven them all wrong. Not by changing who she was, but by refusing to accept anyone else's definition of what she could be. Everyone had mocked the Black Bride for her origins, but they had never bothered to ask who she really was. They had never imagined that she carried within her the strength of generations, the legacy of a grandmother who built an empire, the courage of a mother who chose love over comfort. They had never imagined that the woman they dismissed would one day transform an industry, challenge their deepest prejudices, and force them all to reckon with what they really valued. They had learned their lesson well. And Margaret, she had learned hers too. That the most powerful thing in the world isn't money or status or society's approval. It's knowing your own worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. And that knowledge, once claimed, could never be taken away. Margaret's story reminds us that we should never judge someone by their appearance or circumstances. Behind every person we meet, there's a story we know nothing about, a history, a strength, a potential we might never imagine. How many times have we made assumptions about others based on first impressions? How many times have we dismissed someone because they didn't fit our expectations? If this story touched your heart, if it made you think differently about the people around you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with a friend who's facing judgment. Share it with someone who feels invisible or dismissed. Share it with anyone who needs to be reminded that their worth isn't determined by what others think of them. And remember, the next time you're tempted to judge someone, ask yourself what you might be missing. Because sometimes, the person you dismissed today might be the one who changes the world tomorrow. Thank you for listening to Margaret's story. May we all have the courage to see beyond appearances and the wisdom to recognize that true worth comes from within. What story will you write with your life? What prejudices will you challenge? What change will you make? The choice, as always, is yours.